Hello and welcome to my session. My name is Richard Velasco from the University of Oklahoma, and I'll be talking with you today about tapping into students' community funds of knowledge to inform mathematical learning. Following my presentation, I'll be responding to your questions in the chat space for live Q&A. Now let's get started. The objectives of my presentation today are to, one, share ideas from the Community Funds of Knowledge framework, basically what it is and how I've used this framework within my math teacher education courses that I teach here at the University of Oklahoma, as well as how I've incorporated that framework in as a lens in the ways that I've been talking to some of my teachers from Guam. I still work with some of my teachers from Guam, and I'll be talking a little bit about some examples later on. Throughout this presentation, I'll also be introducing aspects of the Teach Math project. This was a project that I was not a part of, but it is an NSF funded project that I found online, or I was pointed to online, and I use a lot of their modules in my teacher education courses. And I've taken an aspect of it and kind of used that aspect with the work that I'm doing with some of my Guam teachers as well. And then I just wanted to provide resources that might help tap into students' community funds of knowledge that participants might be able to use. I wasn't quite sure about who the audience might be for this presentation, but I feel like the contents of this presentation could be used by current in-service teachers, maybe teacher educators who are working with pre-service teachers, or even school teacher leaders, curriculum coaches, and perhaps even school administrators that they'd like to provide PD for their teachers, for example. So just to give a brief overview of what I plan to talk about throughout the course of this presentation, I'll first give a bit of a background of myself. I think it's important to understand the why of why I'm doing this work and why I think it's important to me, and just to kind of give a little context of how I got into this all. Touch briefly on some of the data and the research that's going on. Again, discuss the funds of knowledge framework, specifically community funds of knowledge. Talk briefly about the Teach Math project. Not too long, just kind of pointing to certain things from that project. And then the bulk of the presentation will discuss a couple aspects of this idea, this notion called community walk, which comes from the Teach Math project, but which I've extended to the teachers that I work with currently. It's not here in the overview, but at the very end, I'm also going to show just a couple examples of how these community walks have been implemented within schools in Guam with some of the Guam teachers that I've worked with, and also some of the teachers that I've worked with in the past. Just a bit of background of myself. Again, I'm currently at the University of Oklahoma, where I am an assistant professor of math education. I currently work with undergraduate and graduate students. Most of the graduate students that I work with are currently in service math teachers, but the bulk of my work is working with pre-service teachers, where I work primarily in the upper elementary math methods courses. So I basically prepare future elementary math teachers. I do work with middle school pre-service teachers as well, which I feel like is more my niche because I myself was a middle school math teacher. My professional career began in Guam, where I'm originally from, born and raised. I taught middle school there for 9 years until I moved to the States in 2016. I received the Presidential Award for Excellence in Mathematics and Science Teaching for the US Territories in 2014. And that really was probably the best professional development experience that I've had. And that was what led me to kind of pursue higher education and wanted to learn more and wanted to know more about the current research and the best practices that are happening out there, for not just for my students, but for all students that that might be affected through this work. I eventually moved to the States in 2016, where I taught high school math in Eastern Washington State, specifically in Pullman, Washington. And in 2018, I achieved a national board certification. And in that same year, I joined an NSF, or I was part of a 10-member group cohort called the STEM Teacher Ambassador Program. And this was a group that was funded by the NSF, National Science Foundation. It was led by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and the National Science Teaching Association. So basically, what it was is it gathered a group of former PAIMS awardees, presidential awardees together to talk about leadership and STEM teacher leadership and policy advocacy. So this was definitely a space that I was very much interested in, especially because I was part of a community back in Guam where I was part of the majority. Um, I wasn't the minority and I wasn't minoritized in that space. I worked with a lot of students, however, who come from non-dominant backgrounds, from minoritized backgrounds, especially students from um, the surrounding outer islands in the Pacific. So I taught math the way that I was taught math growing up. And because Guam is a US territory, we adopt a lot of things from American curriculum. Um, I remember I started teaching just a couple years before Guam adopted the Common Core state standards back in 2011. And, I just kind of taught it from the book and just remembered, okay, maybe this is the way that my teachers taught it and everything. But year after year, there really wasn't any improvement with some of uh, the assess the students' performances in mathematics based on high stakes assessments that were tailored and created in the United States. So I was just really curious to know more about policy in that sense, math education policy specifically. So I joined this group to kind of uh, have discussions really with other teacher leaders across the nation to see what they're doing. But since moving to the States in 2016 and being able to teach in uh, Eastern Washington, I got to realize and be a part of this minoritized group. I was part of the minority at that point, and it was not just a culture shock, but also just a complete new, I feel like, professional shock. I felt like I was teaching in my first year of teaching all over again, just getting adjusted to not just the teaching profession, but also just living in a new context, new new place, adjusting to seasons. But one of the most interesting things that I realized that going to or teaching in the States and moving from the majority to the minority was that there have been there are certain populations, there are certain groups that are really you can see that there's marginalization going on. And I had a good professional development learning experience there, but I also learned a lot about the inequities that are happening in schools. I remember teaching a course that was called credit retrieval, and it was primarily where the students of color were placed. So there wasn't a lot of support. It was essentially just a class where they would sit in front of a computer and go through this program called Alex, and just but there was no teaching involved. I was essentially there as a warm body to make sure that students behaved or kept in line. Um, so all of that just made me really curious to know how I can improve my craft, thinking not just about those students that I was working with in Washington State, but also thinking back to even how I was teaching in Guam and how many of my students from these outer Pacific Islands and how my students from these non-dominant groups, how my teaching might have affected them, or how maybe I could have been more culturally responsive in that certain way. So that's essentially in a nutshell why I got into all of this work. At the end of the day, I kind of want to make all students, whether it be from non-dominant or dominant backgrounds, know that they are math people and that there's no such thing as not being a math person and that they can all do mathematics. But with everything that's happened these past couple of years, it's no surprise that there are widening gaps. The inequities are just growing and they're just more. Some of the um, data just kind of speaks for itself. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, in 2022, the average fourth grade mathematics score decreased by 5 points and was lower than all previous assessment years going back to 2005. So again, we can make the argument that the pandemic probably did exacerbate these gaps or these inequities, but there has been a decrease and a decline since 2005. The average score was 1 point higher compared to 2003. The average eighth grade mathematics score decreased by 8 points compared to 2019 and was lower than all previous assessment years going back to 2003. So, same point, talking to what I mentioned about the fourth grade mathematics scores. In 2022, fourth and eighth grade mathematics scores declined for most states slash jurisdictions, including Guam, as well as for most participating urban districts compared to 2019. And then funneling that data and disaggregating it to the racial and ethnic groups in 2022, average fourth grade mathematics scores decreased for most student groups in comparison to 2019. For example, looking at racial ethnic group scores, these scores declined for American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian, Black, and Hispanic students, students of two or more races, and white students. The score gaps between white students and their Black and Hispanic peers were larger in 2022 than in 2019. Um, and again, an argument can be made that the pandemic might have contributed to this widening gap. Um, but again, these gaps still have continued to widen from the past years. Rate of score declines in mathematics from 2019 to 2022 for Black and Hispanic students contributed to a widening of the score gaps between these groups and their white peers. So I started to think again about reading all of this data. I started to think about, I always think in retrospective about my experiences teaching in Guam. And again, being part of majority in Guam, I'm Filipino, and the majority of the population of Guam are predominantly Chamorro, who are the indigenous population of Guam, and Filipinos. So we make up the two largest demographic groups there. But we have about, I would say, about 45% of students from the outer islands. And we were just pretty much teaching everything the same way, not really considering how maybe students' backgrounds could be a factor into the ways that they are learning mathematics. So I delved into a lot of the research and um, readings since finishing my doctoral program on culturally responsive teaching, what it means to tap into students' funds of knowledge, which is essentially what I wanted to share about today. But more specifically, looking back into their cultural and their community funds of knowledge. Growing up in Guam, it's a very collective society. So there are a lot of um, fiestas, as we call it, or gatherings of communities where we would invite people from within the same village or even from other villages because that's just the way that of life was in or life is currently in Guam, and everybody's part of the community. But I bring that up because thinking back in retrospect in the ways that I taught mathematics in my classrooms in Guam, it was very individualistic. It was um, very much compliant based, meaning that um, students who were well behaved or sat quietly in their seats as they were listening to me lecture, where I could do one sort of problem and then they would have to replicate it. To me, that was what constituted a good math class. And I always envied teachers who knew how to quote unquote control their class. And I attributed that to really excellent teaching. Um, Later on did I only realize how harmful that kind of ideology and that mindset could be for certain students who again comes from collective cultures where there is a lot of sharing and um, a lot of helping each other out kind of situations. And then we would attend, like, I remember attending PDs about certain things, but again it was just this mindset of like, oh, okay, we need to keep them in these rows. So it wasn't until I got to speak to mentors, those who actually took into account students' backgrounds, their cultures, and also the research behind it. It was only through then that I got to see my craft really improve and see some promising results. Um, and again, these were things that I've kind of heard from or like, was told about from veteran teachers, from more experienced teachers. And it wasn't until later where I saw it in the research and being like, and they didn't even know about the research. These mentor teachers didn't know about the research about it as well. They were just saying like, this is what worked. and then it just aligned with what the research is showing for non-dominant groups, non-dominant student populations. So just like many teachers that I knew growing up, and especially in the realm of mathematics, um, a lot of research reports that teachers feel ill-prepared to effectively teach mathematics to students from racially marginalized populations. And there's an argument about, well, we need to keep race out of mathematics, and we can just teach math the way that it is because it's very black and white, that it's a very neutral discipline, that there is no room. But at the end of the day, I think I would argue that it's even beyond the mathematics, it's the students who are trying to teach and what would work best and what we learn from them. I tried to teach it that way many years in Guam, and it still obviously did not really work. And again, until I met some colleagues and some mentor teachers who were doing that work. Research also reports that students possess valuable knowledge, skills, and perspectives from their home and communities that can enhance their mathematical learning. Um, I never took the time to really consider the home and the communities that my students lived in. Guam is a very small island, so it in a sense it kind of feels like just one huge community. But by community here, I'm kind of emphasizing the little micro communities that they may establish in certain parts of the island, for example. I actually taught in the northern part of the island where a majority that's there's a concentrated population of students from the Federated States of Micronesia, which are the population that my school serviced where I taught. So I had a lot of students from Palau, Yap, Chuuk, all of these Micronesian islands, and I did not know a single thing about their culture. I grew up in the public school system in Guam, and I, learned about the Chamorro culture, obviously my home culture, Filipino, but didn't know so much about these cultures from the other islands. And there wasn't really an emphasis to know much about them. In many respects, growing up, there was a lot of complicit racism, I would say. And it's more at the policy level about quote unquote the islanders that kind of come in, how we've kind of like othered them. But again, just kind of growing out of that mindset and being able to learn more about their backgrounds was when I truly got to see the difference in the ways that they learned mathematics. Um, so that brings me to knowing about students' funds of knowledge. So essentially, funds of knowledge is the wealth of cultural and experiential knowledge that students bring from their families and communities. This concept is borrowed from the discipline of anthropology, where researchers looked at things in Mexican American households that kind of contributed to their learning. Um, so they found that students bring in a lot of wealth of knowledge from their experiences that they have at home, or from the language that they speak with their parents, or from even their parents' backgrounds and the ways that they establish community. And since then, it has grown and it extended to other funds of knowledge, such as cultural funds of knowledge, community funds of knowledge. And research has proven that attending to funds of knowledge is crucial for mathematics educators because it fosters a sense of mathematical identity in and engagement from students, leading to positive educational outcomes. So, in essence, when students find that the math work is relatable, or that they can see that themselves within the curriculum, and that concept is borrowed from the concept of windows and mirrors, meaning that, especially for a mirror, right? So a mirror is a reflection. So we say that there is a mirror in our curriculum when the students can see themselves in the curriculum, meaning that they can see their backgrounds, they can see their cultural heritage, perhaps in the math that we're getting to know, that we're introducing to them. So it's very important then, as research has indicated, that tapping into funds of knowledge from students can help with their mathematical learning. So how can math teachers tap into students' funds of knowledge? Well, a lot of teachers already know to get to know their students. That's a common um, aspect that we typically do as teachers, whether it be in the beginning of the school year or even throughout the entire school year. I would argue there's always a wealth of knowledge to get to know your students a little bit more. And a lot of teachers get to know their students, whether it just be speaking with the student or even doing informal interviews with the student, getting to know them, having giving them surveys, but also getting to know students' caregivers. And I use the term caregivers intentionally just because of the changing dynamic of the family unit that is going on. So this was something that I really lacked in as a teacher in Guam and even as a teacher in the States. Um, well, I guess my time as a teacher in the States, it was more synchronous at that point. But back in Guam, and even when I was teaching my students, I didn't really get to know so much about my students' caregivers. And again, growing up in Guam, being in a collective society, sometimes my students' caregivers were not their parents. Sometimes my students' caregivers were their older adult siblings. And to be honest, in many cases, there were still older siblings who were still children themselves, who were the caregivers because their parents were working so much. But they also had like aunts and uncles and grandparents living with them at home. So for me to get to know my students' caregivers was a whole new concept. I would really just call home if there was negative behavior going on or if I wanted to correct specific behavior. Um, so that was definitely something that I lacked in my craft as a teacher. Uh, and then something that is fairly new or fairly foreign and probably has a lot of pushback from a lot of teachers is getting to know students' communities in which they live. Um, because there's an argument that says that okay, there's a lot of time that goes into knowing the students' communities, and there's just so much things that teachers are already doing. So why do we need to add an extra burden to get to know the students' communities? But I would argue that there are ways to kind of incorporate and embed this, whether it be as an individual teacher or even as a collective professional learning community in your department or even as a whole school. I don't think it needs to be something that needs to be done every single day, perhaps, but just a holistic view of how we can improve mathematics learning for our students. So that's where the Teach Math project comes in. Again, I currently teach elementary math methods courses, and just fairly recently, I was pointed to the Teach Math project, which is tailored more for pre-service teachers, but there are a lot of concepts in these modules that I would argue could be used in schools for in-service teachers. Again, I don't think it needs to be tackled by one specific teacher. I think an entire department, excuse me, or entire school as a whole can work collaboratively to apply principles from the Teach Math project. So TEACH is an acronym for Teachers Empowered to Advance Change in Mathematics. It's a project that focuses on integrating children's mathematics thinking, and children's home and community-based funds of knowledge in mathematics methods courses. And again, it's tailored for pre-service teachers, but the one aspect that I'm going to be pulling from that I argue could be used for in-service teachers as well. Funded by the National Science Foundation, working with a team of 6 principal investigators across 6 different universities. So it's a giant multi-million-dollar project. And if you have access to this PowerPoint presentation, I actually linked it there so you can look at it, but it's also the references end of the slide as well. The Teach Math project addresses the key challenge. How can we enhance the ability of teachers to provide quality mathematics education? So it answers that overarching question. Essentially what it is to address that research problem, that need of teachers feeling ill-prepared to teach students from diverse backgrounds. It's best to tackle this issue first in teacher education programs where we're preparing teachers to go out into their classrooms to be ready to work with students from diverse backgrounds. It's basically when you click on the link to go to this site, you'll see a vast array of modules and resources, a lot of documents for you to peruse that you can, and it's very detailed. It shows you how to launch it. Again, it shows you how to launch problems in a teacher education course. But again, I feel like these are resources that you can use to tailor it according to the stakeholders in your school, for example, if you're a teacher or a curriculum coach. So I mentioned already that it's originally intended for pre-service teachers, but I argue that it's helpful for novice, mid-career, or even veteran in-service teachers too, who might not be like myself back in Guam who was not familiar with working with students, caregivers, or community members. Um, so for me, I feel that the best way to work around this or the modules that's provided by the Teach Math project would be to work collaboratively as a professional learning community. Maybe establish it with your department, um, in identifying groups of students that might want to interview caregivers or whatnot. But essentially, the the main point that I'm pulling out from the Math project is this notion of a community walk. So, what exactly is a community walk? So, I've never done a community walk in the past, but when I first started teaching, but I have, and before I even knew what the term was, I remember thinking back to a time when teachers, my co-teachers and I in Guam, actually walked in our community, like literally walked in our community and just wanted to see where the students lived in this part of the island. Uh, Later on, come to find out that there is an actual term for this, which is community walk, that has been coined, right? So in a community walk, teachers conduct one or more visits, including virtual visits in this day and age, right, to the community in which their students live. There are various options for these visits, depending on the particular circumstances of each community. These visits may involve posing and investigating a problem related to community study. So the goals for doing a community walk is that teachers will engage in students' communities by visiting community locations and as much as possible dialoguing with children, families, and community members about their home and community-based activities. Teachers will increase their knowledge and familiarity with students' communities, particularly of activities and practices that might relate to mathematics instruction, and in doing so, challenge deficit-based or stereotypical assumptions about students' communities. So I think what really stood out to me was this idea and this notion of challenging deficit-based or stereotypical assumptions. And to call it straight out, a lot of these stereotypical assumptions that I had of my non-dominant students back in Guam was a lot of it was rooted in racism. A lot of it was just like, oh, okay, they came from this specific group, so we know that they're not going to do very well. But being able to engage in a community walk really got me to see that okay, they bring in their strength. So it really challenges that deficit-based ideology. Engaging in a community walk, teachers will begin to see children as members of communities and see communities as including home and family based activity, as well as broader community relationships, context, and activities. I'm sorry, that was part of the previous bullet point there. But also, another goal is teachers will increase their knowledge of students' out of school activities and practices, including their activities students engage in after school and students' perspectives on their own communities. So I never really got to know like what my students did outside of the classroom and how they went about their days. So that was another goal for the community walk. And then teachers will broaden their perspectives and understandings of students' competencies by recognizing ways that students see and use mathematics in the home and outside of school. So I'm going to talk now just really briefly about what you do during a community walk. And there are a couple variations here. And I know that we don't really have so much time, but I'm happy to discuss it during our Q&A. Um, so one of the variations of doing a community walk is it could be guided, this activity could be guided by a student and or a family member. So in this version of this community walk activity, a teacher or a group of teachers accompanies a child or a student on a real or virtual walk of the student's community. This might involve walking with the student home from school or riding the bus with the student to or from school. During the walk, the teacher dialogues with the child, or with the student, about locations and or activities in the community. In instances when accompanying a student on a walk through his or her community is not possible, teachers can conduct a virtual child-guided community walk. One option for a virtual community walk is that the teacher can ask the student to take photographs of his or her community and bring them to school, or create a presentation for it, for example. The teacher can then discuss those photographs with the student. The goal of the community walk is essentially to learn what the students know of their neighborhood so that teachers are able to incorporate this knowledge into a lesson that they've developed. It's an opportunity for the elementary school student to show the teachers interesting things in the neighborhood that can serve as resources for their lesson planning. So that was tailored more for the individual teacher. But again, if it feels a little bit overwhelming or if it might be too much of a task to take on solo, again, I would suggest working in professional learning communities and maybe teacher small groups, maybe of 3 to 4 teachers. We had a large department back when where I taught in the middle school. I taught in Guam, so it probably wouldn't be ideal for an entire department of maybe 10 or more teachers to walk through a community, or it might be depending on the way it's set up. But in the teacher small group version, teachers conduct one or more visits to various locations in the community surrounding the school. Choice of location may be informed by the by some getting to know you interviews, for example, um, or you might have some opportunities to just interview the students beforehand. So some of these locations that teachers could visit might include parks, stores, businesses, cultural centers, community health centers, banks, professional offices, construction sites, police or fire stations, factories or processing plants, corner stores, restaurants, bakeries, etc. So things that are very specific to the students' community, or could even be like a skate park, for example, that you might have in your community, or even the local grocery store that is probably not a chain or an establishment that's commonly found elsewhere. Uh, and in this, it's suggested that each group visit at least 2 locations, and if possible, should conduct multiple visits. Um, so during the visits, teachers should look for and document evidence of mathematics. So this could include people using mathematics, mathematical concepts or principles, quote unquote, in action, mathematical relationships, quantities, figures, etc. In addition, teachers should talk to individuals who work, play, or shop in the setting about how they use mathematics and when possible, take pictures and or collect artifacts to document evidence of mathematical activity. Um, you can have conversations with community members who work, play, visit, make use of these community locations to be a key part of this activity. So really this knowledge of the students community is vital and is important to doing this community walk, because the point is we get all of this information, teachers glean all this information so that they can make better informed math lessons. Teachers should be discouraged from simply mathematizing something they see on a sign or in a store without also dialoguing with someone in the community about the math that they use, the problems that come up as part of their daily work or activity. With the keeping in mind that the goal here is for teachers to recognize mathematical practices in students' communities. This includes mathematical practices of adults in the setting, mathematical practices of students in the setting. And if possible, teachers can also take pictures and note how each picture evidences mathematics. Finally, teachers should take note of things in a neighborhood or school that they hadn't noticed before or that surprised them. So once the group of teachers have done this, they can come together and collectively plan ways or plan mathematics modules, for example, that they may help introduce to their students. One, I think uh, and there's an argument to be made that it not only makes it culturally responsive for students from non-dominant populations, but it also gives an opportunity for students who are not part of that community to learn more about that community. And I had mentioned earlier the concept of that metaphor of windows and mirrors. So that's essentially the windows metaphor. So a window, like a window into a house, you get to see into the window, like person's home. So essentially, a window is a metaphor of being able to see into somebody else's culture or their backgrounds. So just really quickly, I wanted to just end with a few examples from Guam of some of the, as talking to some of the teachers from Guam that I'm currently working with, some of the community funds of knowledge that they are able to draw upon. So Guam has a local community flea market that they tend to. One teacher visited the flea market because she had realized that one of her students' families sells produce or sells some locally grown crops at this flea market. So she was able to talk to the parents and get to know what things that they sold and was able to incorporate that into her lessons. But she found that it was not just unique to this one student, because she found that a lot of students actually frequent the flea market. I remember growing up, there was a stigma of going to the flea market where, students would basically say like, "Oh, you would only go to the flea market if you're poor." but it helped also beat that stigma. It also helped show that like, no, this is a great place where people meet and convene, and this is where some people make their living. Another example from Guam, during the COVID pandemic, a teacher had conducted a virtual community walk, and then a student had brought in a newspaper clipping about the cases of COVID. So what this teacher did was incorporated that and how it related to Guam, or how it related to specific communities that were being helped in Guam. So again, there's that sense of marginalization, but not only was she able to incorporate the students' newspaper, but it also kind of helped also tackle some inequity issues, some injustice issues that were going on in the island. And then last but not least, so this is a really old picture before I even knew what a community walk was. But we, as a math department from the middle school I taught in, we held a family math night. But before that, we had, as I mentioned earlier, walked through a neighborhood in the community and talked to parents. And we were able to kind of get their input about like, what are some activities that you'd like to see in this family math night. So in this picture here, I hosted a game called the beanbag toss, but it was I forgot the local name for it, but it was a local bean sprout on Guam. And the thing is, what was really fascinating about getting to know this community a little bit more is that they were willing to also help out with the family math night. A lot of these parents from the Pacific Islander community found it to be really refreshing to be able to just invite people, because um, we got a lot of sponsors to bring in food for the families that came in. We had a lot of people donate prizes for raffles at the very end, so it was a really great experience. But I think what even better was that the data showed eventually at the end of the school year that a lot of students' assessment scores increased. I wouldn't say that it's just specifically from the family math night, but I think the family math night was a huge contributor to that, because we looked collectively as a village as a whole. Uh, but even for me, more important and more significant was that a lot of students came out of this family math night really enthused about mathematics. I remember meeting my students the following week, saying how they were so excited about math, and so that for me was already the great part of it. But again, a huge part of it was community involvement, being able to learn more from the community, and how we might incorporate this into our class. So sorry, I kind of just rushed through all of that, and I know we don't really have a lot of time. I might have gone over time, but if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask it in Q&A, or if you'd like to send me an email, my email is richard.velasco@ou.edu. I'm fairly active on what was formerly called Twitter. I believe it's called X now, the X account. I'm still using it for academic purposes and as a professional social media account, and my handle is at RCL Velasco. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to some questions that you might have. Thank you. First of all, Marion, I really appreciate all of your comments here. I'll go ahead and maybe start from the bottom and then work my way back up if we still have time. I wonder how you prevent teachers perceiving themselves from being saviors of students rather than partnering with them and communities. Can you speak to that? That's a really great question. I think it's especially in our local communities where we kind of think that we might go in with some sort of agenda and try to save the community. I think it's more of a process and more of a like it can't just happen immediately. Like I think there has to be a lot of things that start from the very beginning. And we had mentioned how it does like uh sorry, I'm getting a alert saying that's going to end in 30 seconds. That it does seem like it's a novel idea, but I think there are some teachers who still don't know how to incorporate that sense of going into the community and working with them. And so for me, like I'm still learning a lot in terms of how I can work with the community before I start that communication early on, where it's not something that I kind of just come in and immediately say, okay, this is what I want to do and this is what I want to learn. I think first there has to be a reciprocal sense of contribution, where if the parents or like the community and the caregivers of the student are willing to be a part of this sort of collaboration, and that's one way to kind of approach this. And I think especially for mathematics, where it's typically seen as black and white, or it's very neutral, that we shouldn't incorporate these sorts of things. I think it's novel in that sense for many teachers. I see it on some of the teaching educator programs that I've been a part of, and uh, it's just not part of the curriculum that's being taught. So I'm kind of finding that this might be a little bit novel for them. Um, but I think we're out of time, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to address all of your questions. I think I think I have you on X actually, so I can go ahead and continue conversation there, or we can exchange emails.